Welcome to Module 7 of Using Vue with ASP.NET Core by Example. My name is Sean Wildermuth of Wilderminds. In this module, we're going to talk about scaling up Vue for larger projects. We're going to begin by introducing Webpack, talk about module loading, get you to start using later versions of ECMAScript, show you how to debug with Webpack. We'll introduce Typescript as another alternative. We'll take a look at single-file components in Vue, and then we'll talk about turning on compilation in ASP.NET Core projects. Let's get started. So what exactly is Webpack? Webpack is a tool to help you take a bunch of code that you have written and probably the third-party code you're also using and compile it down into a single file or files. In our case, this may be that we would want to build one Webpack for each spa we have in an application, assuming we're going to have, let's say, a spa for shopping and a spa for looking at borders, etc. You can certainly do that, but we're going to look at it for just building one file for our new spa. It can pack up JavaScript, TypeScript, HTML, really any sort of file, depending on how it's configured. And the idea here would be that you have an entry point, some JavaScript or TypeScript file that describes the starting point for your application, and it should be able to walk through that code and figure out all the files that are actually needed and pack them up into one file for you. Webpack can do this for developer time or production time, and likely you'll use it for both. The requirements for each of them are a little different. And it wants to take the idea of module loading and handle it for you. Basically use module loading as a way to decipher what code is necessary to run your project. Introducing Webpack can add some complexity, but it should allow you to simplify the code you're actually running. As you start to build larger and larger applications, Webpack is a way to simplify figuring out all the different pieces of code that your application actually needs. Because that may include not only JavaScript or TypeScript or other languages, but it might also include markup in the form of HTML or some other language, CSS or less or one of those that will allow you to do the design of it, and even other things like JSON files for configuration or for other things. And so it allows you to really take all of the pieces that make up your application and put them in one place. If you're a C# developer, this is much like what happens when you compile an assembly together. The assembly may not only include the code, but might include other assets as well that you'll need, images and icons and fonts and those sorts of things. So let's walk through adding Webpack to the project to see if I can show you, in the simple case, how you would use it. So back in our project, let's take a quick view of that index.cs HTML file. And I'm starting here because even though the markup for our page is fairly simple because we've built this spa in the way we want to load up and allow people to shop, it has required an awful lot of code, a bunch of code from different libraries that we're using, but also a lot of code that we've written. And knowing what order to load these up in, making sure that we have every file that's required on each individual page, that can become a headache to get right. In addition, you're also talking about at least one network request for each and every file we have listed here. And so in getting all of these different files into the browser at once, you're probably talking about slowing startup time, especially for people on slower connections, or often the first time somebody comes to this page. So Webpack is aiming to sort of simplify this. In order to use Webpack, we're going to want to start with the JSON file. And in your project, if you have this section that has all our dependencies, make sure it says dependencies and not dev dependencies. Sometimes when you start this project, it may have the wrong type of dependencies. Dependencies are for runtime dependencies. And then we're going to create a new section down here called dev dependencies. And you could certainly use NPM to create these for you, but we're just going to go ahead and put Webpack in our project. And we're going to get the 4.8.1 version. If you see a later version, it will probably work, but there's no guarantee, of course. And we'll let Visual Studio get these new requirements. And you may see an error when installing the packages. So let's open up a console, just do npm install, and let's see what it actually does as far as errors. So in this particular case, it is showing some warnings, essentially, a low severity vulnerability and some depreciated packages. Now these are packages that Webpack are using, and these may have gone away by the time you actually use it. Sometimes these are introduced and then fixed in later versions of a library. But if we've done it right, we should be able to just say Webpack -- version to make sure it's installed. There, it's installed. Good. We have Webpack actually included. But before it'll work, we actually need a configuration file. So here at the root of the store, I'm going to create a file called webpack.config.js. This is a JavaScript file that's going to contain an object that has all the configuration. So we have that object we want to include in there, and let's put a semicolon after it. In order for it to use it, it's going to use module loading to actually get this configuration. So we need to say module.exports equals this configuration object. And the only thing we'll do is put in an entry point. An entry says, what is the first code file that you're going to use? And you're going to allow me to walk through every file that's needed. It's going to start with some point. And this is usually the last file you've included on the page. And so we can go ahead and say www.root.js app.js. Remember that same file that we were using as the new entry point for our spa. If we go back to the console and just type Webpack, it's going to read this file and it's going to attempt to make a Webpack for it. Now there's some errors in here that I haven't set some standard options in the configuration, but we're going to come back to that in a minute. You can see it's gone through our app.js, it's found it, and it has created a main.js here as the one file that should contain all of our code eventually. We're not quite there yet. So if we open up our project, we'll see there's a new folder called dist. This is the folder that Webpack by default puts compiled code in. And so here we can see that main.js that it created. And if we open it, we can see it's just a compressed version of our project. So by default, if we don't specify that we're using production or development versions, it's going to try to create a production-ready version. So the smallest possible size of file here for us. So let's come back to Webpack config and let's add a new mode. And this is where we can tell it that we want to use it in development mode. And in development mode, if we run this again, it'll do essentially the same thing. But when we look at main.js, we'll see that it is no longer that tiny file, but one that includes more information that we could actually peruse. So this isn't really meant for you to be debugging directly in here. You'll actually see that our file with the view router, etc., creation of the routes, is actually just an object that's going to be evaled at some point. So you're not going to debug this file, but you can see that this is sort of the starting point for what it wants to use when it's going to run this in the browser. Now this is a pretty small file. In fact, it looks a lot like it's just that file we have for app.js, that it hasn't found any other files that we actually need. And that's true. That's in fact what it has done so far. So let's solve this in a couple of different ways. First of all, we can't really have it out here in the dist folder because we need it to be generated in the www root folder. In order to do that, we need to go back to web.config and give it an output. In this way, I'm going to specify the output in a couple different ways. I'm going to first just create the file name. And if I just change this to something like store.js, this would still generate it. Let me make sure there's a comma there. But it would generate it in the same dist folder, and that's not what we want. So we can tell it that we want it in www root, and let's call this dist. So we'll have a new folder inside www root that is these compiled versions. But because it knows we're starting in this dist folder, we actually have to start it with 2 periods to go down one folder and then into www root, because it thinks that the path for all these files is going to be this dist folder that we don't really want to be there. So if we come back over to the console and run it again, a couple things happen. Main entry point here is now our outputted file. And it said that this file is going to be part of main. So if we go and look now in www root, there's now a dist folder with our store.js. So we're closer, but this bugs me that it thinks that there's going to be a dist folder. So what we actually want to do is also say path. And what's our path going to be? It's going to be www root dist, and then we can just leave the file name as actually just the file name. But if we come back over to the console and run Webpack again, we're going to see that the path has to be an absolute path. It can't be a relative path. And so the way to fix that is to actually bring in, using require, which is a way to load modules, we're going to bring in the path library. And then we can simply say path.resolve this, and it will resolve it to our current directory. So with luck, if we try to run Webpack again, it'll now build it in the right point. It's saying that the stores the name. It's not showing us the path. But if I delete this folder and run it again, you'll see it magically appear. So we have that part working. This is where we're going to start from. We're going to build a development version, and we're going to write it out to this specific version. Haven't done a whole lot. All we're doing is packing up that app.js, but we're certainly not able to point our project at this store app yet. In fact, if we go ahead and open up our let's get rid of this dist folder briefly because we're never going to see that again. And open up that root folder. Let's just change this entire thing because this is what we'll eventually want to be able to do with our store.js. This is where we're trying to get to, where our application here is only going to use this one file that Webpack is going to generate for us. And if we run this, We can see that magic file, and it says Vue is not defined. That's the important idea here, is that we're trying to use Vue in our app.js here, but the Vue object itself isn't defined. And you might start heading down this path of like, well, I guess I have to include the Vue JavaScript file. But this idea of Webpack packing these all together is going to include your third-party libraries, not just your code. So let's see what that's going to look like. Let's do that next. So now let's talk about module loading. If you remember from the last video, we noticed that Vue said it's not defined, and that's the first error that our JavaScript file runs into, and it causes everything not to work. Because essentially all that we're doing so far is we're taking this app file and we're compressing it. So how do we tell Webpack that we need Vue? The trick is that Webpack is trying to watch through ECMAScript 6 and above package loading or module. Webpack is trying to walk down through ECMAScript 6 or Typescript module loading to figure out what files to include. And so we have to start to become comfortable with more modern techniques in JavaScript, and the first one's going to be import. Import is going to allow us to point at a file and bring in some symbol or some object into our project. So before we can use the Vue here, we're going to say import Vue from, and we're just going to say Vue. This is essentially going to go look for the Vue type that the module loading will know about and has been exposed to it through the node modules directories and know how to bring that object in. And so if we do that, we should be able to use Vue, but it is also telling Webpack, because we're importing it, we also need Vue inside of our Webpack. So we come back over to our Webpack here and we type Webpack, a couple things happen. First of all, you're going to see that more files are being loaded. You're actually seeing Webpack load in some extra files. There's actually 4 hidden modules here that are also being loaded. If we go ahead and open that store.js, you're going to start to see that more than one project is being loaded now. It's no longer just our one file. It's going to be more and more projects. So here, global is being loaded in, Vue is being loaded in for us. And so Webpack is essentially bringing in these libraries all together. If we go back over to the console and refresh, we'll see that the error has changed, that it now needs Vue router. And that's because we're starting to look at all the different things we need. If we look at the app.js, we're going to need Vue router, we're going to need product list, we're going to need customer, shipping, confirmation. Any type that isn't implicit, we're going to need a way to bring those in. And essentially, this ends up being more and more imports. So we'll do Vue router from Vue router. And so that's bringing in the 2 third-party libraries we need. Of course, I need to type from correctly. And now we need customer, shipping, and confirmation. So I'm going to put a blank line between the libraries and ours, just conventionally so we can see the difference there. And so I'm going to say I want to get customer from. Because it doesn't know necessarily where to get it through some registration means like the node modules is doing, we're actually just going to use paths. So I'm going to say, because it's in the same directory, I'm just going to say customer. Now notice it doesn't say customer.js, it just says customer, and it will look for certain types of files to load those customers. So let's copy this a couple of times for shipping, confirmation, and I'll just fix these up as I can. Shipping. And as you start to write your JavaScript in a more ECMAScript 6 or beyond way, or in TypeScript, you're going to notice that you can start to get development time errors by not using an object type that's going to be available yet. So instead of depending on all of these globals the way we are now, we're going to start depending on the module loading instead to do the work for us. And we'll get there. As we go through this module, we'll start taking those steps until we actually get to that solution by the end of this. So I need a product list, a checkout, product info. This is what normally happens in that first file, because you have a lot of the components all tied together. So there's going to be a lot of these first. Individual files may have much fewer of them. So it looks like I got them all. Let's go ahead and change and fix these paths for a product list, checkout. And notice because it's in the same path, we're getting some help from Visual Studio for this. And if I've done that right, and I go run Webpack again, we're going to see many more files being in here. And in fact, the total size of the project has gotten larger as well. It's now 310 KB instead of the 235 it was after we did Vue. And before then, I think it was like 58K. So it's starting to accumulate more and more of this code. So let's refresh it again, and we'll say, oh no, we're back to Vue is not defined. That doesn't make a lot of sense, except the error is now in customer.js. So because of this change, we're going to need to make the change all the way down. And when I'm converting to Webpack, I usually just iterate through the errors as I find them and try to fix them all. So instead of it being in app.js, it's when app.js actually loads up customer.js that we see this. So let's go ahead and look at customer. And because we're using Vue and v-validate here, we're going to need to do the same here. Vue from Vue, validate from v-validate. These are essentially going to be the same names as we have in the project in the package.json. And I got to stop typing form when I mean from. And if we look down here, there might be more that we need, like Axios. This is another third-party library we're using. So we'll want to go import. Again, the same thing. If it's inside of NPM, you can pretty much get it using the same name. If we continue to look down here, looks like Axios is the last thing we need. So let's find out if that worked. One of the tricks here, instead of having to come back and do Webpack every time, is we can do a -- watch. And this will watch the files as we change the files. And every time we change a file, it will regenerate this, often much faster than running it on its own, because it'll know what file had changed. So here we're getting a warning that the customer object that we're exporting isn't found. And this is where we can start to look at what the other side of that import is, and that's an export. So down here, when we want to actually create this global customer, instead of doing that, we're actually going to say export default equals that. So when someone tries to import the customer object, we're going to return whatever this returns as what we represent as the customer, which is that customer component. So it's really the same thing we were trying to do earlier, except we're using export default to tie with our import customer here. So whatever is resolved in this call gets loaded as this object here so that we can then use it as that component here. Does that make sense? So this does mean we're going to need to make both of those changes, add the imports and then do the export default on each of our files. So I'm going to make a bunch of these changes, and then I'll speed it up in the video so you don't have to watch me make each and every change unless there is something of interest. So let's walk through these. So we've made the changes to all the components that we were trying to load here, except I think maybe the checkout. Yep. Now that we have all that, if we come back here, we can see that it's been building it each and every time, and that successively these repeated ones have been a lot faster than the original one. So it's rebuilt it every time we've touched it. And so let's see what happens here in the browser. Now we're getting a store not defined, and we're getting this in app.js. Must have been one we missed, right? We look at app.js, there is no reference to store except for here. So what is this store? The store is the data store, if you remember right, so we need to import that as well. And then we need to go ahead and fix this one up. And this one's a little bit more elaborate because this is where a lot of our code is being actually executed. So we're going to want to import Vue from Vue. We're going to want to import the symbol underscore from Lodash because we're doing some operations in here using Lodash. And we're telling it that it's now going to be just this object. And we're probably going to need Axios because we're calling it as well. And then down here is going to be the export default. And I think that's all the things we need in here. Let's find out by saving it. See that it added the data store change, so I did. Plus, we're up to 42 hidden modules, so it's building quite a lot. And if we now refresh it, we'll see that Vuex is not defined, because here in the store, we didn't include Vuex. I like showing you as I go through this process because I'm trying to show you how initially when you're converting one to the other, it can be a little bit labor intensive and full of trial and error. But once you start building your projects in this way, you're going to find it a lot more natural and you're not going to have to do it all at once. So we're now getting the we must call Vuex before it, and that's because in our data store, we've never had to make this call before, but now we do because it isn't implicitly being called when we're importing the file directly. So we're going to say use Vuex right here in the first place we're going to use it. And then back in the app.js, I call this data store by habit because that's what I've been calling the same object here. And that's just because most of our components are these constructions. Data store is more of a singleton, and because we're using it to pass it into the view here as store, we actually have to just call it store. So it's up to the consumer of this what they actually call it. So there isn't a tie here between this file and what we're calling it here. Import is essentially creating an alias or a local version of that. And for most of these, they're going to be created almost like a class in C#. But this is importing this object as really a singleton. These are being loaded in as singletons as well, but they're all being used as new customer, new shipping, new confirmation under the covers. So we need to think about that this has to be called store in most cases, just because of the way that Vue allows you to put in the store at the root component and allow it to sort of propagate through our whole system. We refresh one more time when we start to get more code, like product list is actually using its own Axios to get the component template. Now, there are some loaders that'll allow us to get rid of this calling from the server and actually load in the HTML directly. But for now, let's go ahead and import Axios so we can change as little code as we can before we look at the alternatives. And the same line is going to be needed in anything that's using its own remote template. So let's go ahead and go to the customer, or it's using it. Oh, I already loaded it in that one. Refresh again. Now we're running into sort of a funny problem. There's a couple of different ways that Vue wants to work, and one of them is that we're using a runtime build of Vue and the template compiler isn't included. And so there's a couple of different ways to solve this, but the real trick here is that we're not calling the correct version or including the correct version of our JavaScript file. And the way to fix this is we can hint Webpack what version of Vue we want to use. So back in our webpack.js, actually, let's look at the app.js for a minute. You'll notice that getting these, we've been using just this path directly to the data types, and this is something that the Webpack and the importing is going to try to test. It's looking for Vue and trying to figure out what is the right file type for it. And this works correctly for most of the types, but because Vue is a little special, we're going to need to create a new section here called resolve, and resolve is going to allow us to create an exception. We're going to create an alias that's just going to have Vue $, so anything that ends with the word Vue, and then we're going to point it at the actual file we want, which is just this non-production version of Vue, but still using the ECMAScript of the loader. So this is very similar to what it got by default, but what it got by default was a production version. So because this is the development version of this, we want this version. And then when we create a version of the Webpack config for actual production use, we probably won't worry about this or resolve this at all. So if we go back and refresh again, we're still getting the same error. And the reason is kind of annoying. If we go back to where we're running Webpack, you'll notice that it's rerunning this only when one of the actual files is changed. Because we changed the actual configuration element, it doesn't know to restart that whole process. So either you could touch a file, or for me, I just stop it and rerun it again. Luckily, you're going to have to change the Webpack config pretty rarely once you have it set up. We can tell that that was resolved because this now says we're in development mode, which is awesome. But we're getting a bunch of other errors, like failed to resolve filter, doesn't know about weight cursor, and doesn't know about the cart. Now, this is because these are all just JavaScript that registers global objects. We're not actually referring to any of these except in the actual templates. Filters are this way, cart is this way, and certainly the weight cursor is that way as well. And there's a couple of ways to handle this. The first way would be to just go here and use the import-export on these, but we're not really importing a code. So you might think, you know what, I'm going to export default here. And when I import this, it should do what I want, which is true. The other thing to do, if it just is code you need to execute, is that in app.js, we can actually import without getting an object. So I'll say import from weight cursor. I'll do the same for the other two, filters and cart. In Vue, this is useful because there are things that we just want to register globally. One of the other patterns I've seen here is that people will have sort of a single place that then calls all of these individually, so you can have some structure to it. But for now, I'm going to try to keep everything as simple as possible. And finally, I'm getting a Vue not defined in store.js. Let's make sure I didn't miss that. And even though this says store.js, it's actually happening in weight cursor. So in weight cursor, because we're actually using Vue, we still need to do the imports on these. So import Vue from Vue, and it doesn't look like we're using anything else. We don't need to actually export this. We do the same there, and then do the same there. Now, by convention, I usually go ahead and export default on these anyway, in case I did need to use them, because Let's go over to wait cursor and I can export that as well. So that if someone did want to use them. So one of the options here is instead of having any of these really globally, if you really want your files to describe everything that it needs, we could certainly come over here to product list and say import wait cursor from wait. And then I could say components wait cursor. And that would certainly allow us to have each of these pieces be very self-described. But I do like the idea of sort of global components as well. So I'm not going to bother actually importing these. I'm going to depend on the app.js to import these as we need them globally for the global registration. But you can make a decision about how descriptive. One of the benefits in doing the extra work of importing them and then putting them in a component section is that new developers coming to one of these components knows every piece of code that's required. They're not going to rely on some magic global filters and components that they're going to have to find sort of on their own. The other problem here would be how do you go ahead and have two things in one object? And what you can do there is actually export more than one object. If you do want to do that, then you're going to want to use export, and let's say let date filter equal. And so this is going to say that we're going to export several things from our object, not just some default. I'll call this a money filter. And the syntax for actually using it, though we're not going to keep it here, we're going to leave the globalness there, is say import with parentheses from filters, and then we could include one or more of the pieces we want. So I could say date filter, and I could say money filter, if that's what I actually want to import. And this is how you import more than one object from these pieces instead of just one. But we're not going to bother with that because we're not going to tie that all together. But now we should have all of these different pieces exposed in our code. And we continue to have a couple of objects that are still not being used. So here we're missing that import Axios again. And now we have it all working. Now that we've gone through all that trouble, when we refresh this, we're going to see the different code continues to work. It's the same code we wrote the first time. Checkout and then navigation. All those different pieces are going to continue to work in pretty much the same way as they were before, except that now when we look at the networking, we just look at the JavaScript, we'll see that we're getting just store. This is all the JavaScript we're using on the entire page. We're only using these because they're being used by Bootstrap, but the actual store is this one file that ends up being, decently sized, 1.2 meg, but includes all the code we've been dealing with instead of having to call and get that huge list of files. And as we continue to evolve our project, if we are going to use imports and exports, we're going to guarantee that Webpack continues to include those new files. There's an idea in the production build inside Webpack called tree shaking that works sometimes, doesn't work sometimes, but the idea is that instead of pulling in all of Vue or all of Lodash, it's going to go and grab just the pieces necessary so that when you do your production builds, your file should be as small as it possibly can be because it's only going to grab the parts of those projects that it absolutely needs. Now that we've incorporated some of the ECMAScript 6 features by using module loading, let's take this a step further and use some more features to simplify our code using ECMAScript 6. So now let's take a look at using ECMAScript 6 and above. Because we've started to use the module loading from ECMAScript 6, we can start to use and leverage some of the benefits of using this more improved syntax in JavaScript. We're going to see a lot of the same features in Typescript as well, but let's focus on it for JavaScript for now. Let's go ahead and open up that product list. And there's a number of things in here that we've had to do that we could greatly simplify by using this new syntax. So the first thing I'm going to do is anywhere I'm using a function, I can actually get rid of the function name and just say parentheses, and it will know that we're trying to make a function here, right? It's much more like you're going to see in C#, where it's going to be some name, parentheses with parameters if necessary, and that becomes a lot simpler. And so here we can see that the product is going to be the parameter and that buy is going to be the parameter. And this should continue to work identically to what it did before, but it's just a little cleaner to see how that's working. When we start to get into using promises, we'll see this becomes even easier in that instead of passing in a function, we can actually pass in a lambda, just like we can in C#. And the lambda here, the arrow function here in ECMAScript and above where it's used is very interesting because functions and lambdas, even though they look and act very similar to each other in JavaScript, or ECMAScript I should say, they have one big difference. And that is when you create a function, you're creating a function scope that has its own from this pointer. That's why we've had to use this bind here to override the this pointer with whatever is the this in this function. In fact, we can change mount it to that. So by using the lambda instead, or the arrow function if you prefer, actually inherits the this pointer from the surrounding context. So arrow functions are really great when you don't want to have to deal with this. And for callbacks, what I use in almost every case, not only is the syntax more concise, but it's usually more what I want. And so this code should continue to work. And so if I change this to an arrow function as well, this should continue to work without needing to bind for it. And in fact, when we're only doing one thing like we're doing here, just like in C#, we can simplify so that our code becomes that much smaller and frankly should be easier to read. So now that we've made these changes to the product list, we're still running Webpack in the background. Come back over to Firefox or Chrome and run this, nothing should have really changed. All our code should be working in pretty much the same way it always has. But this isn't true everywhere. The thing with Firefox and browsers that are closer to the edge, including even the Edge browser, is that it knows about ECMAScript 6 by default, and all that Webpack is doing so far is just packaging up our JavaScript. What we'd really like to do to support other browsers like Safari, all the different flavors of IE, some of the mobile browsers, is we want to transpile it back down to ECMAScript 5 for us. Let me show you an example. If we open up Internet Explorer, which I super haven't set up well on my system, and just go to that same page, we're going to see the page not work. We're back into that world where we look at the console. We're starting to see things like expected : in the store. And the store.js problem actually probably is in the use on the product list. I know it's saying store here, but it's getting a little confused. It's saying store because this is the main file that we're actually looking at. Because it's expecting there to be a : for property types, because for instance, IE 11 doesn't understand ECMAScript 6 in many ways, and this is one of the first ways you're going to run into. So in order to make it a little bit more compatible, either we could have left all of this with ECMAScript 5 conventions, or we can have Webpack actually build these. In order to compile from ECMAScript 6 or 2015 or whatever the later versions that you might want to use features from, down back into browser-compatible ECMAScript 5 versions, you're going to need a couple of things. So first, we're going to look at package.json, and we're going to add a few more dependencies here for Babel. Babel is a project that will allow us to do that conversion from a newer version of JavaScript back down to a more compatible version. And then inside of Webpack, we're going to create a new section called rules. And rules is just an array of different rules. And the first rule we're going to create is going to have a property for test, for exclude in our case, though we could have used include to limit the scope as well, and something called a loader. So the loader is going to be some piece of code, in this case it's going to be the Babel loader, that we want to use to convert the code on disk to a code that Webpack is going to use to pack it in. It's essentially something getting in the middle of Webpack and the disk, or wherever you're storing your code, to do something with it. So this loader, the Babel loader, is going to look at the JavaScript when we get it, and it's going to convert it back down into the more simple version. So our test is just going to be a regular expression looking for .js files. And then we're going to exclude node modules so it doesn't go crazy and try to run the Babel for anything in the node modules. So none of our projects that are external libraries. Now that we have the test, the exclude, and the loader, we need to put this in a section called module. And then we need one more option here called options. And this is something that is specific to Babel Loader to go ahead and get its presets based on the environment. This so it knows how to actually do the loading. We restart this with watch and we come back over to IE and refresh. We'll see that it's continuing to fail, but it's failing for a different reason. We're now getting the result needing a polyfill for promise. So let's go ahead and look at that index.chtml. You probably put something like a polyfill actually on the layout page, but for now we're just going to go ahead and add it here. This is a polyfill called polyfillmin.js that works especially well with IE 9 and 10. Actually works for 11 as well. But this is adding promises to the system. If you have a later browser that already has the promise object, Vuex as well as some other libraries, including code we're writing, actually need the promise object to exist. And so this just adds it to the project. And now we can see with those changes that this is now working in IE. There's still some differences in the way that Bootstrap is working with it, but we can sort of get around those, and we can see that it continues to work just like it does in the other browser now that we're backfilling it. Now we can see, because we're doing the Babel transpiling as well as putting in that polyfill, that this should work in more and more browsers. We're not depending on browsers to have these edge features. The other benefit of this is we can use the latest version of JavaScript features we want, and we're just going to depend on Babel to convert them into code that will work on older browsers for us. And so it sort of gives us the best of both worlds. We can write modern JavaScript in smart ways and still having compatibility with older browsers. Now that we're using Webpack and the Transpilation all in the browser, we run into the problem of how do we actually debug? Because we're not debugging the actual files we're dealing with, we're debugging something different. So let's look and see how to do that next. Now that we're using Webpack, let's go ahead and figure out how to debug with it. If you're using Firefox or Chrome, Webpack is actually pretty easy to work with. On the Debugger tab, you're going to see the local files that are being delivered. And one of those is going to be that store.js, which is that compiled file from Webpack. But in addition, there's also going to be a section near the bottom that actually says Webpack. This is going to include all the different files that were produced in the Webpack. So you can see the original files here are included so that we can actually look at what files were put into the whole Webpack. And so if we go down to something like customer, we'll see the code that we have, but it has a lot of this generated code. This is the transpiled code that when we started to introduce Babel to take our ECMAScript 6 or 2015 or whatever and port it down to ECMAScript 5, here we're going to see the original code. What we'd really like to do is be able to debug the actual original files. The trick there is actually to go to Webpack config, just put devtool, and then source-map. It tells it that you want to use source maps to go from the original packed files so that when you're debugging, you can look at and actually debug the original files themselves using source maps. Since we've changed the configuration, I'm going to stop the watcher and start it again. And then back in the source, when I look at Webpack again, we're still going to be looking at it inside the Webpack. We're going to see that there are no question marks after the files anymore. That means is if we take a look at, let's say, app, this is going to be the original file that we're actually debugging. So being able to actually put breakpoints in here to stop at actual specific lines that are mapped to our original files. So that as we see bugs in here, we can look at them and not have to, in our brain, transpose them back to the pre-transpiled files. So I would think that almost every case where you want to use Webpack, you're going to want to include using DevTool source map so you can debug in the browsers, again, for Firefox and Chrome especially, your original code. Next, let's take a quick look at TypeScript. So now let's see how to use TypeScript with Vue. Back in Visual Studio, let's go ahead and open up that package.json yet again. This time we're going to add another dev dependency, and that is TypeScript. And whatever version is the latest is the one I would probably take. And you're also going to want a TS loader project. And the idea here is that much like the Babel loader will transpile ECMAScript 6 in 2015 down to ECMAScript 5 for you, the TypeScript loader will work with Webpack to transpile your TypeScript as it packages it in. And of course, TypeScript is going to be the piece that can compile the TypeScript. Before we start using TypeScript, let me close a couple of these folders because we're going to want a new file in here called tsconfig.json. This is a configuration for TypeScript to know how to do the compilation. TypeScript has a lot of options for how it is compilable, and let me walk you through those options as it relates to using it with Vue. So with Vue, you're going to want ES16 as the module type. That's the ECMAScript 16 module declaration, but you want the resolution based on node. And then, much like we did with Babel, we're going to target TypeScript to ES or ECMAScript 5, so it has more compatibility. We're going to go ahead and build source maps so that we can debug TypeScript directly, and then experimental decorators. And this is most useful when you're creating components using the TypeScript and attributed components, which we'll see in a minute. Last thing is I want to include only where I'm going to actually create TypeScript. The problem is that because we're using NPM, that node modules directory might have tons of TypeScript in it, and you can get Visual Studio bogged down in knowing where to look for these TypeScript files. I'm saying just pull it from the www root folder, though you could certainly decide to point it at other directories as well if you prefer. Another option, of course, is to use exclude and just exclude node module and let it find TypeScript through the whole project. Because of the way we're going to use it, I'm only going to add it as files inside of the www root.js folder, just so that we can make sure the build time is as quick as possible. So let's start to use TypeScript by first creating our first TypeScript file, and I'm going to call it product.ts. One of the things we haven't had yet is a way to know what properties are supposed to be on an individual product. And so let's create a type that is the shape of the product we want. We could certainly go and look at what a product looks like, or we could handcraft exactly the properties we want. So I'm going to do what we've done before, was export default class product. The class and product are TypeScript ideas for how to define the shape of objects. And while I could easily put things like ID, name, etc. for the different property types, we might want them typed if we're talking about creating a class that is using TypeScript and using type safety of TypeScript. If you're not familiar with TypeScript, the idea behind it, just to be really clear, is it's a superset of JavaScript that can bring in a few different things, but the biggest thing is compile time type safety. So this idea of compile time type safety means that as you're building larger and larger projects, having the compiler help you to figure out when you have actual bugs. JavaScript being runtime typed means that there is no check at compile time to know that you're using the wrong data type on the wrong property, and so it tends in larger projects to cause more confusion than it helps. TypeScript brings us in by saying, hey, we can define what the types are and check them at compile time. So preferably here what you'd have is ID, let's say number equals 0, and then name string equals empty quotes, for example. And so when someone's going to use a product and it's going to try to assign something like the ID, it's going to guarantee that the compiler is going to try to infer that that's a number. It's not going to do automatic changing of types for you. It's actually going to throw an error that says, we expect this to be a number. Now, it can't really do this with JavaScript and TypeScript mixed, but because it's ultimately going to be all JavaScript, you don't have to convert everything into TypeScript. You can decide where you want type safety as necessary. For our particular case here for products, we open up Firefox. You might remember that we have an API here that actually returns products, right? We have this API that just returns raw data that represents our products. So if we go ahead and show it pretty, what we'd really like to do is define this as a product, right? We have this notion of what a product looks like. So we could certainly look at these and sort of infer what they are, and that's not a bad idea based on what we want to do. But I'm actually going to copy just one instance of this, and I'm just going to go to JSON2ts.com. That will take us to this very cute little site. It's going to allow us to paste in some JSON and have it generate TypeScript based on it. So here we can see it's created an interface for this root object, and then it's typed each of the properties here based on that root object. Let's just grab the export root object here. Then back in Visual Studio, I'm just going to paste it here, except I'm going to change this to be a class. I'm going to change this to be called product. So we've now got the representative of a class that is strongly typed to the data types that each of the properties have. So now that we have the product defined here, we could go into other parts of our system like data store, and of course we could make, instead of this catalog being just this array, assuming we were going to convert this to TypeScript, we could say things like array product in order to type it to the kind of array it really is. Now, whether you want to use TypeScript or not, know that most of what you're going to do in Vue actually can be supported by it. So let's give you an example. Let's go to a simple part of our project like the shipping file. And in this case, I'm just going to rename shipping to TS to make it into a TypeScript file. So now that I've renamed this to a TypeScript file, you might be curious, what doesn't work here that we've defined in the TypeScript file? Actually, nothing. One of the ideas behind TypeScript isn't to indicate that you have to use type safety, that you have to use classes, that you have to use ECMAScript features that aren't yet supported by the browsers. The idea is that it's a superset of JavaScript. So all of this plain old JavaScript we're using here will continue to work. TypeScript doesn't implore you to change that in many ways. But if you want to go towards creating components in more of a class-oriented way, Vue and TypeScript together will help you do that. So let's see what that looks like. So to do this in a more TypeScript way, we're going to need to do a couple of things. First, we're going to actually need a separate package from Vue that allows us to define components using a component decorator or something that looks like a .NET attribute. So what we're going to want is the Vue class component. And once we get that, we can go back to our shipping type and just say import component from Vue class component, right? The same name that we called the project. And then we can actually say at component. And if you've done Angular before, this might look familiar because the pattern is very much the same. And our template can live directly in that component. And because it's a component, it wants to decorate a class. So what are we going to do here? We're going to actually say export default class, and we'll call it our shipping. And it's going to extend the Vue class, or deriving from the Vue class in our case. So we no longer need Vue component. We're just declaring a class. We're defining the template as a part of the component. And then we can even set up data sections by just adding properties. So let's go ahead and import product from product. And then we can say current product, even though we're not really going to use this to do much, is a product, and we're going to start with it being uninitialized. And so this type safety of the current product means that if we needed to use it someplace, it would not only give us a list of those objects, but would guarantee that during compilation that what was assigned to it was always a product, not just some random object. Now the object doesn't have to have the typeness of a product, it just has to look and feel or be duck typed to a product. Because in our product, we decided to export the class specifically, this would be good if we had more than one class. So we're going to change this to actually say default. And the difference between default and not using default is if you don't say default, you're going to need to use these curly braces because it's going to assume that this file or this piece of code is going to export one or more things, and these parentheses are going to specify or allow you to specify what to take out of that. In our case, product is just fine. Now we have product there, we can see what it actually is, and we can do the same thing for methods. So if we wanted to do an onBuy or a approve shipping method, we could just write some code, right? The magic of what's happening here because of the class component is that we're able to define the data section and the methods as just members of the class. We can even do overrides like mounted as a class as well, and it will map it to the right thing. And so there is a clarity and a cleanliness to defining your components using TypeScript versus JavaScript. So it really depends on what you're more comfortable with. Some of the magic that's happening here with TypeScript, I'm not a huge fan of, and so I don't usually use TypeScript with Vue, especially since I start small and build up. But there are cases when you're building large applications, you can find a lot of benefit. Now, we do have a small problem in that if we look, we can see that it can't find the shipping file for us. We're getting an error in Webpack that it can't find this file that used to exist that it wants to be able to build. Of course, we renamed shipping to shipping.ts, and so we're going to need to tell Webpack how we want to handle TypeScript. By default, it does not do any of that. And so what we're going to do is, just like we did with the Babel loader, is we're going to actually create a new rule. So I'm just going to copy this rule and make some changes. So it's obviously going to be for TypeScript files. We're going to exclude anything in node module. And the loader is the TS loader that we had added to the package.json. And this doesn't require any options. So now that we've made this small change, let's stop our Webpack and restart it. And notice that it still can't find the shipping because it's still expecting it to be a JavaScript file. So let's stop this and let's see how to resolve that. The trick here is to tell Webpack when it's resolving modules or it's resolving different imports, what kind of files you want to use. And in our case, we're going to use both TS files and JS files. Later on, you might add other extensions to allow some different things, but for now, that should do it. So when we go ahead and start it again, should continue and do it, and you'll notice that shipping is now a TS file. It's no longer a JS file. It's going to treat them as the same. And if we go back to our code and refresh, we'll see over in Webpack that TS and JS are right next to each other. And we can actually look at the TS file that we are using, and we could actually set breakpoints directly inside that code if that's what we wanted. And so this is going to allow you to debug your original JS files, but also your TypeScript files. Now that we have TypeScript working in Webpack, let's take a look at how to get Visual Studio to actually do these builds for you, so you don't always have to open up a command line. So now let's talk about single file components in Vue. So Vue has a special relationship in that it has this idea of something called single file components. If we look at the way we've developed components so far, we've done it with sort of pure JavaScript. We've done it with TypeScript in the case of shipping, classes and such. And now we're going to do it in one third way, which is something called a single file component. So wait cursor, I'm going to rename to waitcursor.view, which is the convention. And when I open this, it's going to want each of these parts of the design to be separated. So right now we have sort of the definition of the body in one place, and then we have the code that's related to it in another place. So let's create a section up here called template. And one of the benefits of using this template syntax is that it's going to allow us to actually edit it in an HTML way, and will allow the editor here to give us the clues and the IntelliSense we want that we weren't getting when we're using it purely from code. But we can also set up a script block here for the rest of this, which is actually the actual script. So in this case, we'll just export, without even naming it, the simple code-only part of our project. And what's interesting about what we're doing here is we're separating the script from the template. We can even have a style section that is, in our case, scoped to the code we're using. So in case we wanted to come up here and look at it and say that, let's say FAS spinner should be color red for some reason, well, you could do that. This would be style that's specific to this file and this file only. And the way we get the views to actually work is we need to go back to package.json, and we're going to need a few more loaders. So we're going to need first a view loader, which knows how to load the views. Not surprisingly, we're going to need a CS loader, which knows how to load CS as well. And we're going to need the Vue template compiler. The reason for this is when the single file components are being loaded, we're actually going to compile the template into the resulting code. So the template isn't going to be the markup anymore. It's going to be the compiled template that Vue needs so that it doesn't have to do that at runtime. So these tend to end up being even faster. And we're going to also need the Vue style loader. This is the piece that tells the Vue loader that it can import inline style. And this actually depends on the CSS loader, which is why we're going to include both of them. Back in the Vue, since we're not using the Vue.component, which is going to allow us to specify the name of the component, we can actually do that here instead. So we can get rid of the view since we're not actually using it. And so we now have a wait cursor that actually works. The difference is that when we look at the compilation, it's now saying it's looking for the wait cursor.js because we haven't told it about the loader that we want to use yet. So let's go back to the Webpack config. And unsurprisingly, you probably know that we're going to need a new one for Vue. And this is going to be called the Vue loader. We're also going to need one for CSS. And because of this, we want the import to be able to work from Vue or CSS. We want to add those as extensions for the resolution of the modules. We stop the process and we start it all over again. And the error we're getting is indicating that we're missing a plugin in my web.config. So we're going to need that plugin, and we can get that by actually getting the Vue loader plugin by calling the require to the plugin. This is getting the plugin from a path into the Vue loader. And then here, somewhere, you're going to want to specify the plugins. This is going to take an array, and we're going to want to call new Vue loader plugin to instantiate the plugin itself. And that should be the missing piece to make the single file components actually load. And so if we go ahead and restart this, we'll see that it's actually loaded it. And when we look, we're going to see that wait cursor view is in there, and then wait cursor view script, style, and template are all being loaded as individual pieces. So that loader knows to pull those apart into those three pieces for us. One thing you'll notice, it says Typescript lang equals JS. And here we could have specified the lang as TS for TypeScript, and it would then deal with it as a TypeScript file. So we could certainly have had type safety and other pieces in here if we actually needed them. I'm going to leave it as JS since we're doing it as simple of a way as possible to allow this to continue to work. Now, we've seen that using Webpack for projects as they grow larger can really help you get a sense of what you need, because as you add new files, those files are going to be included into Webpack based on the imports that you include on particular files. So if I needed another library here, if I needed to import something like Lodash, and Lodash wasn't used by anything else, it would magically become part of Webpack. And so you don't have to keep up with all the different pieces, just use them as necessary. But having to open up the console and handle that all by yourself is something that it isn't quite as comfortable. And so we'd like to have a way to have Visual Studio handle that. And let's take a look at that next. So now let's talk about firing Webpack in our ASP.NET Core projects. There's really two ways that we want to handle this. The first is I'd like to have a way for Visual Studio to just keep on running Webpack and watching those files as necessary. So if you go up into Tools and look at Extensions and Updates, this is where all the tools you've installed are. There's one called Webpack Task Runner. And I already have this installed, but this is the one you'll want to go get and install by looking online. And this adds Webpack support inside the Task Runner Explorer. It says 2015, but it certainly works fine for 2017. And with that installed, you can go to the Webpack file, right-click, and say Task Runner Explorer, and it's going to open that file up in Task Runner Explorer. And one of the things you can have it do is, let's say, watch in development mode, and I want to bind it to Project Open. In that case, every time I open the project, it's going to run Webpack with a watch. So it's created this binding for us. In fact, we'll see that it's done this by actually putting a comment at the top of the Webpack file. So if we look at Task Runner Explorer, let's go ahead and just run it so we can see what happens. There, it's doing the same thing we were doing in the console, but it'll happen by default when you open up this project. So if we go into one of the files, let's go to shipping.ts, and let's rename this on approve shipping. Because it saw a change, it went ahead and continued that compilation step. Here it is again, doing the watch. And so it'll stay in that little window the whole time while you're doing development, continuing to run Webpack. Now, if you change the Webpack configuration, you'll need to go back in here, right-click, and say run, or even refresh in order to get all the information about Webpack running. You can also turn on some of these options, which changes how it actually runs this. Now, when I first did this, there was actually a problem. Webpack worked fine when running it from a console, but it did not work well in the task runner. It was actually failing every time. And one of the reasons, if we go to options inside the tools, is that inside of Projects and Solutions External Web Tools, there'll be a list of all the paths that we need. And this bottom one is interesting. This is probably further up on yours. Yours probably looks something like this when you opened it, or maybe this, but I think probably this. And this is pointing at an installation of Node that happened when you installed Visual Studio. Often this is a much older version of Node than the one you want to be using. And so I've gotten into the habit of moving it down. So if we can't find the tool we're looking for, we'll default down to this. But we always want this at the end because I had a newer version of Node in NPM much further up on the path. And the Task Runner Explorer uses that path when it figures out how to run these. So that's an important difference. Having the Task Runner Explorer is great for development, but what about when you're actually like deploying or creating production? In that case, you're going to want to make a change actually to the CSproj. CSproj, which is the file that contains the different parts of your project, what references you're using, what tools you're using, etc. We're going to create a new section here called target. We're going to name the target Webpack run, or you could call it whatever you want. And then we're going to say before a target, and that before target is going to be publish. So before we publish our project, especially from a CI server, or especially if you're deploying it in Azure, you're going to want something to happen. And that something is going to be an exec with the command of, unsurprisingly, Webpack, in order to actually run Webpack for your project. Now here's where you could certainly use some of their options of pointing at a webpack.release.js. So you could point it at different versions of the Webpack configuration file. But for now, I'm just going to leave it to build the same one. So in this way, when you're using the .NET Publish feature in ASP.NET Core, it will make sure that Webpack is one of the commands that are issued. In fact, because we're getting Webpack, we probably want to include a couple things like npm install, make sure all the tools are there, and any other tools we want to run. But in our case, these are the two tools we want to run before a publish happens, just in case. Because remember, there's a number of occasions where you're not actually going to be running builds using Visual Studio, but using MS Build instead. And this will allow it to solve that for you. Let's wrap up this module. So in this module, we've talked about scaling Vue up to larger and larger projects. We can see that some of the tooling that we've talked about is helpful when the number of JS files that you're using becomes overwhelming. You can introduce these tools, specifically Webpack, to try to simplify them. The idea behind Webpack is to package up your application so you have a smaller number of files to actually deploy to your servers, and more importantly, fewer number of files for the web browser to have to download. While we're using Webpack, we were able to go and use later versions of ECMAScript and even use Typescript so we can reduce the bugs in our larger applications. And then finally, I talked about single file components as a way to package up your components in a way that may be more comfortable for you. Next, in our last module, we're going to talk about using authentication with our Vue project.